Well, thank you for joining us at ALN Thursday at 3. My name is Mike Bordenaro. I'm the Executive Director of the Asset Leadership Network, and we've been waiting and anxious to hear this report from Mike Aimone on the report that he chaired, Strategies for Renewing Federal Facilities for the National Academy of Sciences. And he's going to give us a special presentation. We're going to have a PowerPoint and then discussion on the overview of the report. But first, we want to talk about some of our upcoming activities. So next week, we're going to have a little history lesson. Founding members of the ALN are going to talk about what was going on 10 years ago this month when the ALN was being formed. So we're going to be speaking with Robert Kaler and Rich Culbertson, and others might be joining us in that program. We'll be having a number of special 10-year anniversary programs that we hope you enjoy. We want to thank our organizational members, our Platinum organizational member, Onuma Inc., and our ALN patron members, Jacobs, ABS Quality Evaluations, Definitive Logic, CGI, who we have a white paper that we're going to be publishing with very shortly. And our organizational members, the Andrew James Advisory Group is sponsoring this week's program. They've got an upcoming ALN A55K professional certification program coming up, so you might want to talk with them about that. And our other organizational members. And we are very happy for their support. We wouldn't be able to do these types of programs without that kind of support, and we're very grateful for it. So Mike Aimone has been an ALN Senior Fellow since the ALN Senior Fellow program began. I remember the first meeting with Mike Aimone and Jack Kelly in underground near the Pentagon. Mike, you want to join us? You immediately understood the value of the ISO 55000 asset management system and was very interested in connecting with the Asset Leadership Network from that very beginning meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that.
And you're telling me an interesting story about your background. You want to give a quick overview of your background before we get into the report?
Well, sure. Thank you. And good afternoon or morning for those of you. Good afternoon to you, and thanks for inviting me to spend an hour with you. As Mike mentioned, I'm Mike Aimone. I was the former Office of the Secretary of Defense senior leader in the area of real property management. Title was a little bit different, but that's a good descriptor of it. You might call it asset management. And prior to that, I was a longtime Air Force personnel asset, but an asset that managed Air Force facilities, and the last 6 years of my career, Air Force logistics, which included Air Force facilities. So Mike, back to you.
Well, you also have some background with the National Academies. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with them over the years?
Well, sure. As many of you may know, the National Academies have an organization called the Federal Facilities Council, and I've acted as a member of the Air Force and then a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense on the Federal Facilities Council, which is an element underneath the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. As such, I had the opportunity in about 2012, 2013 to be on the study group that was published a set of recommendations on predicting the outcome from the investments of real property. So that led me to help lead the newest study, the study that we're going to be talking about today, a strategy for renewal of federal facilities.
Jack Dempsey was going to be with us, but had work, so he couldn't join this meeting, which we're glad to know that the network is working. He's working with another ALN Senior Fellow. And he has a wonderful series of weekly papers that have explained the National Academy series. So you were involved in the previous one, and you were saying earlier that you immediately said that you're not done. What was your thought when you were finishing the last paper?
Well, thanks, Mike. Well, that gets us a little bit into the study format, so I'll defer a little bit to that answer as we evolve the slide. But suffice to say, the Academy's research studies, starting in the 1980s and evolving, were more or less on the study of effective operations and maintenance expenses to maintain facilities. This is first departure into a larger discussion that says you really need to think about the capital plan, the capital asset plan, as well as the sustainment plan. And the two of those have to work in tandem, and you'll see that in the report.
Okay, so
have to work together in order to effectively have strategic renewal.
and I can't think of a better lead in to the report, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I am flying solo, so we won't be able to get into any of the questions until after the report, after your presentation. People, please feel free to write your questions as they come up so that they're in the chat, but I'll be looking at them after Mike goes through a few slides to give the overview.
Well, thanks, Mike. And, suffice to say, my goal here is to try to move through these slides, and Mike will make these available after the fact. If you want to download the full report, on the cover page will give you the one of the URLs. I'm not sure why they're using the Department of Interior for that, but be that as it may, you can pull down the full report if you would, and it's free if you print it as a PDF. Myself, in fact, served as the chair and the vice chair for this study group that kicked off in 2019. Right before COVID, as a matter of fact. And part of the delay in getting to the end game was getting through the writing process and the editing process, peer review process, and the like in the world of COVID. Next slide. Chance. So the genesis of this report and the authority is pretty simple. The Federal Facilities Council, which is made up of the federal departments and agencies working under the umbrella of the Board of Infrastructure and the Constructed Environment, felt that there was a need to take a look at the subject of renewal. It's been thrown around a little bit, particularly, frankly, I know of it from the word urban renewal. And what we ended up strapping in was a discussion about what is it that they mean by the word renewal, and they've come up with that answer on the next slide. But we were given a statement of task, and the statement of task was to identify strategies for the effective renewal of federal facilities. Next slide, if I could. This is, as background, is part of a larger set of studies that occurred in the 1990s. I said in the 1980s, but 1990s forward, with the last one being the 2012 study, which was entitled Predicting the Outcomes. That's the first 6 studies on the left at the bottom. In 2019, followed by 2 studies in 2023, was the beginning of a series of studies looking beyond the sustainment of real property. And so this report, which was a strategy report, was used in part to implement a study done by one of the federal agencies at what it could use this study to do in renewing their campus in Boulder as well as in Gaithersburg, Maryland. So enough to say that this has been the business of the National Academies for 20 or 30 years, and they're effectively carrying it forward. There's a whole set of studies that we suggested to the National Academies that picks up on these strategies and to bring tasks to bear on how you would implement these strategies. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So next slide, if I could. So probably the biggest challenge, and this was occupied a good share of the year 2019, was what did we mean by renewal? What did the Federal Facilities Council, what did the Board on Infrastructure really mean by this word called renewal and what was its meaning. And we looked into other studies in the national academies. There was a series of studies done by the Transportation Board looking at federal highways renewal. Similar issue of what's in federal real property. That's to say, an older and aging superhighway and bridges issue across the nation. And how do you, if you will, not just invest in their maintenance and repair, but invest in their renewal as an asset for the next century. And we came to a conclusion on that subject. But, and that's enough on that slide. We'll move on to the basic realization.
Was that enough on that slide? I could go back.
No, don't. That's fine. We were
Okay.
done. I think this suffice to say, basically the committee started by looking at the published documents out there, A Circular 11 and 123, as well as several policy memos that OMB has issued in the last number of years, including their most recent one, Memo 22-14, which began to look at capital planning in support of the future workforce. This was in the height of COVID that it was being written, 2022 is a specific, and we had purview of that as we were moving where we wanted to go and how we wanted to shape these documents, because on their own, they don't go far enough. And let's just say right there, we'll give you some reasons why and how in the next couple slides. So we looked at those, we combined them with several GAO reports that we were familiar with, and had not only the OMB as well as the GAO folks talk to us about what their strategies were when they were writing these documents. But of particular interest, of course, was ISO 55000 as from a asset management systems approach, as also, more importantly, from my book, a introduction to risk management and asset management using the principles of ISO 31000. And of course, you can't pick up on the ISO series in asset management without the technical coordinating report 251. Next slide. Forming that background in 2019, that asset renewal, a idea of asset renewal is one of combining capital planning with sustainment planning. And if I were to leave anything behind with you, that's what's bold about what we're talking about. This isn't about a capital plan. This is not about a sustainment plan, but this is a melding of the planning and programming and thinking into a systems thinking approach that looks at the combination of both day-to-day money, O&M money, as well as capital planning money. And in fact, working a budgeting process that works between those lines. We knew we couldn't, if you will, tear down the budgeting process between capital and operations and maintenance planning, but we think both can be informed by each other. I know as a facility engineer over the years, Mike, I'll need you to go back. I know as a facilities engineer in my own planning, the number of times that I invested in some significant sustainment action to only find out that headquarters was going to basically demolish the building and rebuild it. And I had no idea of that as a local planner. And the local planners had no mechanism for communicating to higher headquarters what their strategy was with regards to sustainment funding. And so that, if everything else I say today falls on deaf ears, what we were talking about doing was integrating the planning process between the operations and maintenance and the capital plan. We had 6 chapters, and I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about each of the chapters. And I'll use the findings here as kind of a way of weaving the story of the chapters. Chapters 2 and chapter 3 kind of fit together. Chapters 2 and 3, primarily written by Jack Dempsey, weaves the stout knowledge of what is in the OMB policies, as well as what is in the GAO reports. And to help us with that, we had Brian Lepore as the chapter author, primarily at chapter 3 with Jack. So chapters 2 and 3 set the foundation of what is the existing policy that the federal government is working on in the area of facility asset management. Chapter 4 brought out a whole idea of let's look at the basis of data to inform the decision-making process, as well as the analytical tools. Chapter 5 introduced a topic, frankly, just scratching the surface. And in my opinion, there's a whole study area that needs to be done in asset planning, risk management, both on the risk side and the vulnerability side. So Chapter 5 addresses risk. Chapter 6 is the guts of the report, in my opinion, because it began to make recommendations how A11 and A123 can be wickered with a capital asset planning memo in 22 to bring forward strategies that might improve the linkages of today's money with tomorrow's money. While there are 26 findings in the report, and the findings are inherent to the chapters, and I wanted to go through that depth of knowledge on the chapters. Think of this as your speed read through the chapters. The next brings the 5 recommendations together. Mike, next
Thank you
slide.
for the speed read, Mike.
So we had 5 recommendations. The first was implement a federal facility asset management system. We'd stop short of saying implement ISO 55000, but we said based on ISO 55000, giving the OMB and the agencies opportunity to bring their best practices and processes that they already have in place into the concepts of strategic thinking. Once you do that, we've addressed this a couple times in the talk so far. This brings the whole idea of working with the comptroller community on capital planning and ensuring capital planning and asset sustainment planning work together. Frankly, we think the National Strategy for the Efficient Use of Real Property, the 2020 and its predecessor in 2018, are critical memos. We think they need to wrap in this whole idea of asset planning from a capital point of view. There are indeed needs to improve the data models, improve the data, expand the models, and then have the feedback loop on the measures so that the measures in the analysis, the analytics from the data and the models drive improved decision making. And then finally, implement this into a series of policies. This isn't a vision, this is a set of policies by, frankly, just fine tuning A11, A123, as well as a series of memos that have been written by OMB on the subject of facility asset management. So next slide, if I could. And if my voice begins to wither on you, Mike, just say speak louder. So the federal agencies have a series of takeaways. They've got to think about this from a strategic planning point of view. They got to think about this as a community planning point. We had one agency who briefed us just as we were going into COVID. In fact, it was one of the last briefings before we kind of shut down the information gathering. And this agency basically said, in order to make the budget meet over the next 50 years, given what we think is going to be the horizon of the budget line for facilities, we first of all need to delete some of the facilities in the asset list. We can't maintain the number of buildings we have with the funds we. Then they started looking at models that predicted outcomes, much like proposed in 2012 study. And they found an eureka moment where they basically said, the strategy they've been using for years of basically, let's find the worst building that we know we need to keep, and let's fix that worst building first. But they basically said, if the building is past some particular point in its depreciation, let's not fix the building. Let's eliminate the building. Let's take the little bit of O&M money we have and spread it over those buildings that don't take as much effort and cost and human capital to make them effective, and make sure that in the process they're renewed, not only to meet the needs that are in the mission set now, but meet the needs of the mission going forward. So their strategy was not worse first, but let's take the most important building to the mission. Or if it isn't a building that's focused on the mission, if it's in good enough shape, can it be renewed or torn down and rebuilt, or demolished and find another facility? And this is what the definition of renewal is all about. It's take the best building for the need, or delete it and put a new building in its place to meet the needs of the mission now and in the future. If the federal agencies need to be thinking about this whole concept of asset strategic planning and putting it into a format of facility renewal, not sustainment, until the point where you tear it down and rebuild. But that sustainment going into the continuous renewal of the facility. Then the Office of Management and Budget, and frankly, Congress. And when we talked to OMB, they said, you know, you got to really put Congress into this discussion. It's not within the purview of the national academies to make congressional legislative proposals. But certainly, from my point of view, the Office of Management and Budget has the responsibility to put the right kinds of policy and the right kinds of documents incorporating ISO 55000 principles and requirements into that process. And then if we don't have the feedback with the Government Accountability Office to give back critical information about how things are going and how they can be improved incrementally as we move forward, GAO needs to have a good understanding of some of the outcomes of this report so that they can look at these as they make recommendations in the facility asset management portfolio. Next slide. Further takeaways, frankly. Strategies, and that's what we laid out, a set of strategies, a strategy of using the ISO 55000 as a template, a strategy that takes a look at governance documents and updating those government documents, a strategy that relooks at some of our data collection and asset modeling projections. And then finally, a set of provisions in the area of capital planning. For example, the ability that possibly a capital asset revolving working fund could be used for facilities management across at least the civil sector. Department of Defense in their own way have that working in their authorities. They exist already. They didn't quite call that, but it can certainly be considered as part of the process. However, they would benefit from having a truly working capital fund. In any event, all those sets of strategies turn into a asset management systems autonomy that ends up finally into a set of documents. And if that doesn't get written into policy, it's not going to happen. Next slide, I think, if you would please. Oh yeah, I'm going to skip over this one because I pretty much said it. There's some, I won't say scrap and throw away, but there's some rewrite required of A11, 123, and 126, or 136. So suffice to say, there's an outline for that. So my concluding points, and then hopefully we can go to conversation here. The strategies proposed are the kind of how-to strategies that we think need to be done. Frankly, we think the departments and agencies know what to do. They just, when they get to the budget process, it falls short of implementation. And that's somewhat on the congressional side, that's somewhat on the agency side. That's somewhat about having the comptroller community or the real asset planning process be part of the fiduciary process of the department and agency. This is about creating real property as part of the agency strategic plan. This is about corporate decision making. The agency I mentioned that had this eureka moment and said, wait a minute, we should be stopped doing this worst first policy and taking a look at our whole asset base and ask the question, what is the best next facility we should invest in? And how does that optimize the budget over the 50 years or 30 years in the planning horizon? That's something that can't be done without the comptroller community part of it. And we can't do it without the agency senior leadership absolutely bought into the process. That agency ended up having a letter signed by all of their operating divisions, stating something along the lines of facilities are very important. But then again, the OSD comptroller, in one of his comments to us when he briefed us at the very end, and this was captured in the last chapter when we were talking about some of the senior agency comments, the OSD comptroller at the time basically said, you know, facilities are important to me to a point, and then I have to balance with other requirements. So give me your best shot of where your next best dollar is going to go, because there isn't enough to go across all the needs that are across the department defense. And that's just one agency speaking to us. And that's my concluding thoughts. Mike, I'd like to turn it over and see if we got any conversation out of this.
Yeah, we've got some questions that I'll get to, but before we go to those, thank you for that. And it was a meticulously planned report based in history and with an intention. It's really appreciated and supported by the Asset Leadership Network. So thank you for taking time to give us the Cliff Notes understanding of that very important document.
And let me just jump in there, Mike, to say, this committee was made up of 12 professionals from across the community. This committee also suffered under the handicap of COVID, in that all of our writing was done virtually. And with that came a challenge of having the right kinds of words in between the chapters so that each of the chapters fit together. And my hat's off to the committee for their work. But a committee like this doesn't produce unless it has a peer review committee, a peer review of independent experts who look at the study critically. And we had that. And the report, frankly, is way better off because of the independent review and criticism, as any reviewer should give to any kind of scholarly work. And we appreciate the work of the roughly 7 to 8, 10 people that were on the review committee. And then finally, the National Academy staff and the staff of the National Academy Press. This report couldn't be put together in the format it is in without having the skills of the Academy staff and the National Academy Press editors involved. So thanks for letting me put those words in there. I forgot to do that early on.
Oh, thanks for remembering. So we've got a bunch of questions and we got a comment that just popped up, appreciating the work you did and looking forward to diving deep into it. And can you speak more about the process of stakeholder engagement internally and externally? Now, you just talked about how the paper was, you involved stakeholders on that. I believe Cecilia is talking about the involvement of stakeholders in the planning process, but basically that's what you're doing by saying that the comptroller has to be linked with the facility asset information that get all of those stakeholders together. And that's the critical part that you're saying.
Yeah, and I'll give some of my own personal views on this. This isn't the Academy's view, but first of all, within the Department of Defense, I had the opportunity to lead for the 4 years I was there, our efforts at getting to a financially reportable audit in the facilities area. I became very much part of the comptroller staff because it was the comptroller's lead effort. And there was a trust built that as we then retired, I retired anyway, and started writing this report, I could begin to have those kinds of conversations with the OSD comptroller, who, by the way, at that time turned out to be my former boss. So that was interesting. So my boss became the acting comptroller towards the end of the administration, and we were able to have some very good conversations about how facilities survive. But I'll give you the example the Air Force used, and this is out there, and if you need the document, I can get it to you. The Assistant Secretary, who happened to have a relationship with the Secretary of the Air Force, was able to work hand in hand with the commanders of the individual commands within the Air Force Base Command, at the time Air Force Base Command, Air Force Materiel Command, and the like, to begin this whole process of 4-star engagement on the facilities decision-making process. And this turned into a strategically smart move on Secretary Henderson's point of view, in that what it got was broke down some of the barriers of sure, after my weapon system first. Because of course that's what's out there, is the warfighting needs have got to trump the facilities need. but you have to do it in a way that everything fits together. And if you can sell the story that without the runway, the weapon system doesn't operate, you begin to break down some of the challenges of, well, let's fix the runway. Well, let's fix the hangars. Well, let's fix the maintenance facilities, and working our way down through the mission assets to the direct mission support assets. Enough on that answer. Building a
Okay.
relationship between the senior leaders is what this strategic thinking is all about.
And the National Academies is an excellent forum for that. It's through the National Academies that the GAO decided to do the Federal Facility Asset Management Report, which is one of the ones cited in your report. And I wonder, what kind of influence do you think this coming from the National Academies can have on OMB? Is there any indication of where that might go?
Well, we're having conversations. It's premature to give any idea where it might go because I'm not sure. But I can tell you that the GAO and the academies have had conversations, as have OMB, and other meetings are on the schedule.
Okay, that's very good to know. Okay, we've got a question from Marty Rowland, ALN Senior Fellow, saying he's worked for many government jobs and none would allow the word failure to appear in any permanent record, not even emails. So what has been the effect of calling out past failures?
Well, I can tell you it got the attention of the agencies and more importantly, the organizations involved. And, as we say in another slide a little bit later on, the fix is not a throw it away and start all over. The fix is integrating some system thinking into what's already there.
Excellent. I think that's part of the freedom that the National Academies gives you.
Well, I mean, it's what we called it to be. The same thing, we made a critical comment with regards to Builder, a Army Corps of Engineer management tool, but it has to be read in context. The context is Builder is not Builder as it is written today is not a capital asset planning tool. It's a sustainment model. And could it include capital asset planning? Yes, absolutely. It needs a data set to do it.
Okay, and then Marty continues that and asks that the way it would be phrased, a system not determined to have failed, but nothing exists to demonstrate its level of success. So I think what he's saying there is that this linking of the systems would allow the check, the plan, do, check process.
Yeah, well, and I'll suggest to you, and I'm a consumer, of course, A11 and A123 and the like. I mean, I've been reading and using those documents through my military career for years, and it is what formed the basis of my thinking. But that thinking was what I would call, I would think of it as a linear thinking. How do I take an asset that's near end of life? Excuse me for that. How do you take an asset that's moving towards end of life and sustaining it, as opposed to, well, maybe I don't want to take that asset to the end of life. Maybe I want to discard it now and spend the money I would have spent on it on some other facilities. Maybe spread that money onto other facilities. That is nonlinear thinking, and so that's the kind of things we think need to be written better into the current guidance. Then the other part of this, of course, probably the major part of Chapter 6, is how can we improve the capital planning process that exists within the federal government? And the way you do that is get away from 1-year money and 1-year planning cycles.
And connecting the asset data with the comptroller needs is a good way to start doing that.
Well, I'll go one step further. I think you've really got to be, there's only really one asset base, and it's the agency asset base. There's only one data set, and it's the asset database set of the agency, and that's all in one wonderful view. Excuse me. It's all in one linked system, so that when you prod here, you can see the results there. They can't
That
be in separate, distinct silos that don't ever interface with each other.
that I think is actually the takeaway. And if you can just get that into policy, I know it's not through the national academies. Maybe the ALN will go for an asset database for the entire agency, and then have your financial and your maintenance and other informations coming out of that.
You know, it's a trick, right? Because it's a big organization when you get it down to the field level.
Yeah, and in order for organizations to grow, they break into divisions. That's natural human nature. And creating those silos creates efficiencies. But now, since the report from the previous report came out, the explosion of technology is allowing the breaking down of those silos in ways that haven't happened before. So the timing of this report, I don't know if it's in conjunction with the advent of this technology, but it's perfectly supported by what is actually capable now.
Well, certainly informed by that. And, you know, our thought process is it's a whole, well, let's back up here a little bit. You know, the real problem, right, is the guy at the field level is forced to input data into something he doesn't understand why it's being done. He doesn't use that data for anything. And it isn't part of his worldview. And so what goes in there as data isn't necessarily good data. So the only way you're going to get good data in the database is that people at all levels of the organization, from the lowest level that's collecting the data to the highest level that is acting on decisions, has to feel comfortable that the data is being used by all parties.
And that the data is accurate.
Right. Well, let's put it this way. If it's not accurate, then the guy that did put the inaccurate data in there loses opportunity. But he gets immediate feedback that says you didn't get a award of X because your data in this field was not so good.
And then Cecilia Mowat, who is president of ALN Member Organization Strategy and Site, has a two-part question. And it starts off with the prioritization process that you mentioned for Department of Defense indirect mission support versus mission. And can you speak more about balancing those needs and how might this help that?
Right. Well, it was a subset agency of the Department of Defense. It wasn't all of the Office of Secretary of Defense. Yeah, essentially what the commander saw in front of them as a dashboard showed essentially a year over year articulation of the status of facilities. Every facility was visualized as a pixel on the chart, where on the left were true operational facilities and the far right was support facilities. And you get a sense, depending on how you turn the lever, of how one department, one operating command looked compared to another operating command, and how some kinds of facilities look versus other size facilities. But unless there's more budget authority, there's always going to be losers out there. The key is limiting the losers and finding a way to find them their space. And it may be outside of the appropriated funding mechanism.
We've had the Air Force present to us a couple of times, and they were advanced users of, was it Tririga? No, I forget the software program that was really advanced to help them understand their mission dependency index and evaluate if this is the case, then what's important? If this is the case, then this is important. That was a really impressive display of trying to balance those issues.
The key, though, it wasn't buried inside the civil engineering world. It was at the corporate decision-making level.
Okay. Then the second part of this, because Cecilia is a lawyer who has done real estate for corporations and understands the difference between ownership and leasing. And she's just bringing up that if there's any issues that causes in this evaluation of prioritization and renewal.
Well, I will suggest you add one more complexity, and that is within the federal space, and this exists in some other organizations. There's a third category, which is essentially privatized. So it's not leased, it's owned by others for the benefit of an agency.
And then we've got,
and so there are many examples of that privatization initiative, yet somehow or another the funding mechanism has to work true for that over the life cycle of those privatized assets. So don't forget there's another category in there. But yeah, no, the advantage of leasing is if you don't need it, you can terminate it. If you own it, you got it, and you can either tear it down or sustain it. Or worse, you don't sustain it, you don't tear it down, and as a new user, a new mission comes in, they beg and steal and say, hey, I really need a facility. I'll take that old dilapidated building and I'll move into it as my mission need, and I'll fix it up. And forever, they're never getting to the point where they have a fixed up building.
so you might know Ed Safety. He was a top engineer at the VA. He's now with Guidehouse. And he says that, Mike, what you just said about data is so dead on point. May I add one thing? How the data are used and how the data contributed to decision-making must be openly shared with that person in the field who initially supplied it.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, basically his boss needs to know that because his employee didn't have that data in there, he lost whatever it is he lost. And when that boss sees that data, which he'd never really looked at what they were doing, frankly, he'd say, wait a minute. A good example, I was a lieutenant in 1970. The real property community worked for me. They put a report together called the Real Property Plan for the military installation I was on. I was a second lieutenant. These two GS7s worked a year each year on this plan. I basically looked at it and thumbed my thumb through it, never really understood it. And that's what went up to higher headquarters. And I can remember this day, this was over 50 years ago, I got a phone call from somebody from the Pentagon, way out in military installation. His name was Mr. Mixon. But of course, over the phone, it came out, Mr. Nixon is calling you. You can see the time frame I was doing this in. And he was asking me, the lieutenant, why this data was saying this. And, my tail was between my legs when I looked at the data and says, no, that's not right. Well, I personally tell you that I took a lot better, closer look at the real property plan before it went forward the year after. Mr. Mixon never called me again. And I soon moved PCS to another base and doing a different thing, and didn't think about that until I started running a job that used to be run by Mr. Nixon in the office of the Secretary of Defense.
So Jack Kelly has joined us to make this also one of our ALN 10th year anniversary presentations. Jack, remember when we first met with Mike?
Sure do.
That was
I remember.
That was a good get, as they say.
Absolutely fantastic. And this, and I really congratulate Mike and Jack and the whole team that wrote this report, because I consider this one of the milestone reports in the evolution of federal thinking about facilities and asset management generally. So hats off. But one of the things that I don't think the report addresses, that I think is a fundamental challenge that the federal government has inflicted on itself in two ways. One, I'm a heretic within OMB for saying this, and that is the unified budget leads to some very it creates a competition between operating expenses and capital expenses that often operates to the detriment of capital investments. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is more of a DoD unique thing than I'm aware other agencies do it, is that DoD makes a separation between military investments, MILCON, military construction, and operating expenses. And they create a wall between those two expense categories that I think is detrimental to smart decision making. Because I'll give you an example. I used to work with a strategic sourcing initiative. And one of the things I learned from the Air Force is they had an interesting phenomenon that occurred at the end of each fiscal year at some of their installations. The installations would have excess operating expense money, and so they would go out and they would buy new furniture. They might have just bought new furniture the previous year, but they would go out and buy new furniture again because that was a way they could burn up that extra operating expense money, and they didn't want to have any left over. Unfortunately, you could have a situation on a base where that extra money could have been used in a constructive way on the facility side, but that wasn't permitted. And maybe I misunderstood that, Mike, but that was something that struck me as an unfortunate consequence of that dichotomy and the way funds were managed.
Well, Chapter 7 of the report really tried to address that. And frankly, DoD is a little bit different than the typical federal agency. The typical federal agency sees one or two capital projects a year, whereas the Department of Defense is bigger footprint, bigger facilities budget, has a bigger military construction program, although you could look at it as a percent of a plant replacement value and compare notes on this. But because the civil sector capital planning is chunky, you get a big project and then you don't see anything for 5 years. Then you get another project. You don't build a workforce that is used to this. Likewise, you don't have a little bit of money left over for project 1 that can be used on project 2 because the expense category is expired. Let me rephrase this with regards to end of year funding. Here's my worldview. I would get a budget for operations and maintenance towards the beginning of the year, and I'd lay that out for the strategy of my operating expenses. And I knew there'd be some emergency stuff that would take out of maybe next month's account. I'd have to wicker that. But somewhere around June, the commanders would come to me and say, we're going to borrow some of your O&M money, but we promise we'll give it back to you on September 25th. And they would be true to their day. They would give me the money back. And so it was now feast or famine. Now I would take my engineer force, I would build construction projects or repair projects to fill that vacuum. And I had a bunch of IDIQ, independent, indefinite quantity,
indefinite quantity
kind of contracts, so that I could lay in a bunch of roofing towards the end of the year, because roofing is always something I was going to do every year anyway. So why spend it in April and May? Why didn't I spend it in September, obligate it, and let them do the roofing in the springtime of the year, if you will. So, but I had the funds obligated before the end of the fiscal year. So I would build a budget of X, right, for this category. And I would build this against what I called my backlog of maintenance and repair. But what happened after a while, and I had a pretty good engineering crew. If I said we need to do $100 million worth of projects on the book, they'd give me 100 million. If I said 150 million, they give me 150 million. And so what really was frustrating to headquarters was no matter how much money they threw at me, I had an engineering staff that already planned to do that. Now, there was an upper limit to that, right? But the point was, if I knew they were going to borrow 25 million, I'd have 50 million in reserve. So it wouldn't go to furniture because I could show my boss it's here. This is ready to obligate. In fact, some of this is pre-obligated, just waiting for the awardment funds before the end of the fiscal year type of thing. And I was the guy that was sitting with the procurement officials at midnight on September 30th, getting the last dollar scooped into the right place. But I will tell you, those awards at the end of the fiscal year are not as valuable, are not as cost effective than projects that I'm awarding in January, February, and March, the first and second quarter of the year, when firms are hungry for money and work. So there's about 4 things packed in there. Chapter 7 was all about bringing the capital planning process and the operations and maintenance process in some form of visibility. We didn't go as far as saying take the barriers down, because we thought that was too far to go. But there are ways that the right people working together can see the value of each. Long answer, sorry.
Oh, I love it. That kind of gets to the heart of the issue. Because when Jack asked the question, I was like, I think that's kind of what the report is trying to address in its own humble way.
Right. But there's the last question out there that Cecilia talked about, which was, what about the external stakeholders? That's say the government landlords. And yeah, that's, critically, I had a planning, when I was at base level, I had a planning charrette, if you will, 4 times a year, once a quarter, with essentially my fellow commanders at the lieutenant colonel level. And I said, here's what we're doing, full transparency, transportation's getting this, maintenance is getting this, here's the percent of the budget, here's the percent of facilities, here's the need space, et cetera, et cetera. I heard from those commanders all the way through the rest of my career, we became colonels and then beyond, about, wow, why didn't that kind of a process replicate across the Air Force? It was being done, I can tell you, because I didn't steal it. I stole it from a lieutenant colonel friend of mine who was implementing at his base. And I said, that's a good idea. And so this is about transparency, because if you get the landlords working, what the landlords do is they feed it up to their commanders outside of the chain of the wing commander, their maintenance commander, their transportation commander, their supply commander. And lo and behold, there I was at the end of my career, where all those commanders, supply, transportation, security, police, and the like, all reported to me, and they were all telling me about facility stuff. Of course, I was a facilities guy, so they'd want to do that, keep me out of their logistics business.
Does the report address any of the problems that come from the government's accounting process? Jack, we've talked about that before.
Well, so that's, it's not so much the accounting process, it's the way the financial reports, it's the way assets are valued in financial statements. One of the things that we've talked about before in this forum is that, you take a look at Australia, which was, I think most people would say, is at the forefront of asset management implementation around the world. And they got the show rolling at the municipal level back in the 90s, when the accounting, their auditor general basically imposed 2 things: accrual accounting on the way that the budgets were written and the financial reports were generated, and what they call replacement fair value valuation for assets. And that allowed a correlation to be made at the operating level, at the budgeting level, between investments in facilities and the consequent results in terms of the evaluation of those facilities. So if they invested properly, it would maintain the value, sometimes even increase the value. And if they invested poorly, the fair value would diminish. So that link between budget investment decisions and the resulting value of the assets was a critical factor in Australia's embracing of asset management at the local level to begin with. And so that's,
I would have
Mike's
to defer to I'd have to defer to David Hahn in chapter 7 on that. I don't think so. That's a good
Well,
point.
no,
Jack.
it's, well, in the federal budget, the federal, the way property is valued on the federal financial statements is the traditional, or is it traditional for the US depreciated value.
Right.
And so that depreciated value has nothing to do with the actual intrinsic value of the property.
Right.
So so we can't make that link in this country, and that's a US problem. That's not just a US government problem.
Where I was going with that is, did we address or anything like that in the report? I don't, maybe our risk chapter came the closest to that. Because this is really an issue, of course, about, so if I only have $1 to spend, should I fix the runway or should I fix the swimming pool? And I can tell you the answer on that without any hesitation. I'll tell you my boss's answer on that without any hesitation.
Right. Well, the Air Force, you mentioned I don't think you called out the Air Force as the agency that had this more advanced way of doing things, but it had to be the Air Force because it's the only.
I kind of tried to
I've
hint at that myself. Mike didn't want to say it, but we've seen some great presentations from the Air Force.
Absolutely great. I mean, it's that was like that one presentation that you talked about, Mike, that with the kind of the ribbons. That's one of the most powerful presentations I've ever seen in terms of helping understand consequences of investment strategies. And
we've got to give credit to Mike Aimone and his career in the Department of Defense, in that the Australians based their asset management initiatives on Department of Defense standards. And Peter Kohler will tell you to this day that if you follow Department of Defense standards, you are more than halfway there to ISO 55001.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike. And thank you, Jack, for jumping in and joining us. We've been very excited about this presentation, and it went swimmingly. I was a little scared about all the words on the sides, but you handled that very well. So in conclusion, do you have anything to say, Mike?
No, thanks for inviting Jack and I, and Jack in spirit pass his regards, and we thank ALN for their time today.